Good morning, students. Bio 102, finally, and Lecture 1. We are going to start with basic stuff, animal form and function. So we already studied Bio 101, and now we have graduated to 102, and we're going to look at some very simple concepts to build on them and to proceed in complexity. We're going to look at the challenges of life. In Bio 101, we actually defined what was life. We looked at how difficult it is actually to pinpoint a definition of life that is valid. And we came up with something that is the current definition of life as given by latest research, and that was life is a chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution that resists entropy. And it was a mouthful, but we looked at it and we studied it and we understood it. And now we're going to look at what are the challenges for life and for all organisms. There is an enormous diversity in facing the same challenges of life. All organisms do have to feed. So there's diversity in how to feed. All organisms do have to fight off infection. And yes, while we don't really particularly care if a bacteria gets an infection, it is still an infection. And there are many, many ways to fight it. And all organisms do have to reproduce because that is one of the basic parts of the definition of life. There are enormous levels of organization to face these pressures, and they have developed over millions of years of evolution. There are different anatomical and physiological methods to face these challenges, and different ways to keep the internal environmental temperature constant, which is pretty important because, as we learned, proteins denature and all life works on chemical reactions which are sped up by enzymes, which are actually proteins. So the internal temperature has to be kept constant. There are bounds and limits, and so we can't actually talk about life and just think that, well, it could get really, really, really big or really, really, really small. There are limits. There are limits to what life can actually do. While it is very resilient, they have to fall. These limits have to fall within the laws of physics that exist. The diversity still has to fall within these bounds. For instance, strength of muscles. You can't actually go out of bounds in developing the strength of a muscle. There is a certain limit, and after that, it just won't work. You can't actually go faster. Movement can't. There's a limit to where movement cannot go faster. Gravity itself is a defined unit, so there's a limit for that. As we studied, diffusion is very slow, and there's a limit for that too. And heat exchange, there's many, many things that an organism has to do while it's living, and they all fall into some limits of physics, but they also have limits of chemistry. Bonds, we looked at bonds in 101. We looked at all kinds of bonds, like chemical bonds, covalent, polar covalent, ionic, and weak chemical bonds. And they all have limits because they have a certain amount of energy that is stored in those bonds. You cannot break all those bonds unless you get over the big activation barrier, the Gibbs free energy that we discussed. So there are limits to life that are imposed upon by chemistry and physics. And this is what we discussed in Bio 101 too, that while under the laws of physics and chemistry, there should be no life. But the laws of biology are superimposed on the laws of physics and chemistry, and they are ways to get around those laws, but we can only do it temporarily because entropy must always increase. And so an organism can only live for so long because he is going against the laws of physics, which always will dominate in the end. So these limits and boundary conditions impose limits on how big an organism can actually get. Or how small can an organism actually get? What is the minimum size before an organism can boot up? And what is the maximum size? So in the Hollywood movies, we see things like great big apes or great big monsters, and they thunder around on the surface of the earth, and they're bigger than the Empire State Building. And well, actually, that is a very fine imagination, but in reality, we can't actually get that big because of the laws of physics and chemistry, and we're going to look at those. And also the general form of living organisms, that the form that we acquire, which is mostly tubular. And there's also a pattern of life. And so there are all kinds of limits and boundaries that are imposed upon biology and living organisms by these laws of physics and chemistry. So we're going to look at body plans first, and we're going to look at what happens to body plans. Generally speaking, living forms assume a tubular shape. And I have brought in a few examples, and you can look at them and you can say, well, okay, so we are pretty much tubular. Jellyfish, you can sort of say they're tubular, and maybe even a bear, pretty much tubular. Fishes are tubular looking. And all right, so here we come to trees. This part is definitely tubular, but the canopy is not. The canopy is an adaptation so that the organism can obtain maximum sunshine to produce food. But generally speaking, when the canopy is empty and the full leaves have fallen down, then it is indeed tubular. So plants and animals generally, no matter how complex or how simple they are, will assume a tubular shape because that is a very good shape to be in. And why is that exactly? Because of the environmental pressures. They act on life forms and they make them assume this shape. The reason is the basic plan is to reduce the amount of energy expended and to try and maximize the energy received for the creature's growth. Generally speaking, body plans are either radial, which means they have symmetry in a radial direction, like this, which would be this, or they have bilateral symmetry, which is us, because you can actually cut us down in the center. This side is exactly the same as this side. Or they can be totally asymmetrical. And those would be very low forms of life, and they would be asymmetrical. But generally speaking, most life forms assume a tubular shape, no matter how asymmetrical or symmetrical they are, and they always try to have repeating units. So in the radial symmetry, as you can see, every unit is just a repetition of the other unit. In bilateral symmetry, we have one half. This half is being the same as the next half. And there's cephalization. So cephalic means head. So cephalization means there is a front and a back to the organization or organism. And so there's a head where most of the processes are being controlled, and then there's the rest of the body. So body plans generally try to reduce the surface area if the goal is to maximize speed, which means you would be actually using food. And that would be like in something who has to go fast to avoid predators or to catch prey. And body plans will generally increase surface area if the goal is to produce food. Refinements and adaptations evolve to allow every available energy niche to be used. So from these plans, we refine and we adapt. And the reason is we want to maximize the energy that we receive to make it useful for us to do work. So if you change the size of an object but keep its shape constant, something curious happens. Let's say, so this is just a thought exercise because you're thinking now, why do we have to be tubular? All right, so let's just look at it. Let's say that you increase the length by a factor of 2. Areas are proportional to length squared, but the new length is twice the old length. So the new area is going to be proportional to the square of twice the old area. That is, the new area is not twice the old area, but actually 4 times the old area. So, and that just comes from the formula of area, because length is times length is area, right? So if you have 2 lengths, then 2 times 2 is 4. So you're actually not doubling it, but it's 4 times. So when we look at this, and here is a picture of King Kong, you know, he's looming over New York City, or I'm not sure which city that is, but what it's showing is that the root of this problem of size limit lies in just simple geometry. If we scale up a square, what happens? So here's a square, and every side is one unit, let's say 1 inch. Well, we double it and double the size of it. So now every square side is 2. Okay, this area now is just length times length. It becomes 4 times as much by doubling the length. So as the size changes, the volume change is faster than the area. And areas change faster than linear dimensions. Okay, so what will happen is, and here's another example. So we looked at squares. Okay, so fine, you know, we can talk about squares. The area of an object in a square will be 4 times as much if we double it. Here is a rectangle. Okay, so let's assume that there's an organism that looks rectangular. All right, well, here we go. We double one side, and then we double the entire organism. And what do we get? Okay, so the ratio is, again, this would be 1:4. And here is a triangle. And so we have a triangle with sides 3, 4, 5, and the area of the triangle is 6 cubic units, and we get 1:4 again. So because we doubled it, everything here is doubled. So the 4 is doubled to 8, the 3 is doubled to 6, the 5 is doubled to 10, and so this triangle is double the size of the little one, and again you would get the area of an object being, by just doubling the one side or a length of it, it actually becomes 4 times. It doesn't double, it becomes 4 times. So geometry is going to restrain biology, and so therefore when you look at organisms, so we have these insects called water striders, and they actually walk on water, which is kind of cool. If you look at them, they can just skim around on water. But what they need is long feet, not big feet, so that they can skate on the surface of a pond. So that's an example of how geometry is going to shape the organism's form. Geckos, we looked at geckos in Bio 101 in weak chemical bonds. Well, geckos don't need long feet. They need broad, flat feet. And they're covered with millions of tiny little hairs, which produce those positive charges to walk on a ceiling or a wall. And a bird that flies into a window could actually break its neck. And you've seen this many times. Birds don't understand glass, and so they don't see it. They think it's a clear area, and they slam right into it. And the shock of that, the force of that collision will actually get them to be, at the very least, stunned, but most likely they will die because they will break its neck. But a fly, who is much smaller, will fly into a window and it'll just bounce right back without any injury, because Why is that? So the collision forces are proportional to the volume. And so the inertial forces that we see in a collision, they are actually proportional to the volume of the colliding object. And the forces produced by a muscle or the strength of a bone are also proportional to their cross-sectional areas. Okay, so the weight of the animal is therefore going to be proportional to its volume. So that's why King Kong is not a realistic depiction. Here are the pictures of those organisms we just talked about. So notice the water strider's feet. They're long. Notice the gecko's feet. They're broad. These are each toes. And here is a picture of a bird flying into a window. He doesn't see it and he falls off and most likely dies. Whereas a fly flying into a window is just going to bounce off and it'll be fine. It'll fly off again. So there are limits on size also because not just geometry, but also because the exchange of nutrients and waste must be done for every single cell if the organism is multicellular, which a lot of eukaryotes are mostly multicellular. If the organism is unicellular, there is really not much problem because the nutrients and waste simply diffuse in or out, but then again, there's the limit of diffusion. However, it is not such a big problem. In multicellular organisms, however, they need dedicated organs for these functions. So they have to organize their body parts and allocate resources for just one organ type to do one particular function for the entire organism. So the rate of exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen is proportional to the area. So this little symbol here means proportional, and I wrote it out because I won't most likely be writing it out again, but whenever I write that just means proportional. So the rate of exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen, which is highly important for metabolism, is proportional to the area, but whereas the amount of exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen is proportional to volume. So notice the rate of exchange is proportional to area, but the amount of exchange is proportional to volume. All right. Let's see if I can erase. No, I can't erase. Never mind. Although the skin is the largest organ that any organism has, the internal surfaces are actually 25 times greater than the skin surface area. So you might think, what is she saying? Well, because the inside, all our organs are made out of skin and the organs are actually invaginated. So when you look at this, and if I opened this out, this would actually be a really long thread. If I took this and I traced it out, and I traced it out over here, it would become a very, very long thread. So this would be, let's say, an alveoli. If you opened it up and you stretched out the entire alveoli, it would be a very, very long piece of skin, whereas, it is enclosed inside a lung, and the lung is enclosed inside the chest cavity, and the chest cavity is enclosed inside us, and we aren't that big. So inside us, there's a whole lot of complexity, and the internal surfaces are a whole lot greater than the external surfaces. Also, there is the square-cube law, which we should look at, because there's an actual law which determines how big an organism can actually get. And it depends on the rate at which oxygen is extracted from the air. That is proportional to the surface area of the lungs. The rate at which food is digested and absorbed is proportional to the surface area of the gut. So again, proportional to the surface area. The rate at which heat is lost, so we're always losing heat because we need to keep our body temperature constant, is proportional to the surface area of the body. But the rate at which oxygen or food must be supplied, or the rate at which the heat is produced, is proportional to the mass, which is really the volume of the animal. And the square-cube law describes the relationship between the volume and the area as a shape's size increases. And this is something you most likely saw in lower grades in math. So this is a very old concept. It's Galileo even talked about it in 1638, and he said the ratio of two volumes is greater than the ratio of their surface. Well, that makes sense because he explained it. He said, I believe that a little dog might carry on its back 2 or 3 dogs of the same size, but I doubt if a horse could carry even 1 horse of its own size. So you can see right away the square-cube law, the ratio of 2 volumes is greater than the ratio of their surface. So this is something that is very fundamental, and it manifests itself in muscle size. So the cross-section of a muscle is only going to increase by the square of the scaling factor, but the mass is going to increase by the cube. So that's why it's called a square-cube law. For instance, let's say somebody is 60 feet tall or 60 inches tall. It doesn't really matter. He's going to weigh, let's say he's 60 feet. He's going to weigh 1,000 times someone who's 6 feet, because every square inch of a giant bone is going to have to support 10 times the weight. Yes? Okay? See? 6 feet times 10 is 60. But he's actually going to have to support 1,000 times the weight. So that is enormous. So the bone is not going to be able to support a really, really, really big muscle. And the human thigh bone, which is the strongest bone in your body, will break under about 10 times the human weight. So, you know, if you say that you're 6 feet, 10 times weight is going to actually make you 60 feet, your bones would break. So the thighs of a 60-foot human would actually break every time they took a step. So that isn't going to work. So that is why there are limits on how big organisms can get. When we talk about flying monsters, again, not just organisms that walk, but why can't things that fly get bigger? Well, wings generate lift due to the motion of air over the wing surface. So that would be here, over the wing surface. So if this is a wing, this is where the lift is. Okay, larger wings move more air. So an animal with a large wing, relative to its mass, it's also known as low wing loading, will have more lift available at any given speed, enabling it to take off and land at lower speeds and turn faster. Okay, so this is great. This is excellent. However, larger animals would have to fly faster to gain the same amount of lift. And so there is a limit. There's an upper critical limit for bird flight, and that's about 5 pounds per square foot. So that's about 25 kilograms per meter square. And we see this every day. Again, something small like an ant is not seriously injured when you can drop him from even the top of the Empire State Building. He's not going to get smashed. He's just going to take a second and then calmly crawl off again, because the air resistance per unit mass is higher for small animals, and so it's not going to really bother him. But the air resistance for large animals is going to be extremely, it's going to be a limit that we can't actually get over. So there's also the pressure of natural selection, and we looked at natural selection last in Bio 101, and we saw that natural selection is actually the survival of the fittest, and that ensures that only those offspring thrive that did better than the rest of their kind or that population in that set of environmental conditions. And so since there's enormous diversity in a population, a tiny advantage can endow enormous gains on that organism. And similarly, a tiny disadvantage could lead to its early demise. So this really should be a 2, and it will be eliminated from the gene pool. Multicellularity will increase complexity, and we would understand that. More detailed information can be received by the organism of the environment, and once that organism has more information, because information is power, then that organism can control a lot of the release of its energy to create an internal stable environment. So multicellularity is a great thing, because then we can actually get more information about the environment, so we can survive better under changing conditions. So when we have a hierarchical organization, that results in new and emergent properties. So we can just have cells, and then an aggregate of cells will make a tissue. Then a bunch of tissues get together and make an organ. And then you can have many organs that can get together and make an organ system. So successive levels of structural and functional organization arise in life forms, and these result in the emergence of organs and tissues. And cells, which are the basic unit of life, organization of cells results in tissues or groups of a type, for example, a muscle. And we looked at muscle cells, sarcomeres, in 101 as well. Different tissues get together to form an organ. So that would be, for instance, for example, a heart, and several organs working together in concert for one goal, form a system, like the digestive system, could be the circulatory system. It doesn't have to be just digestive, it could be circulatory, it could be nervous, it could be anything. But we have many systems, and they all are composed of many organs working together. So now we are going to look at some common systems, and we're going to actually explore a few and see what makes them unique and what are their functions. For instance, we have a digestive system. In the digestive system, we have many organs. So there is, it starts out with the mouth, and then we have a pharynx, and then we have an esophagus, the stomach, and the intestines, and then there are assorted helper organs called the liver and pancreas that are part of the digestive system. The circulatory system consists of the heart, blood vessels, and blood. So that's a pretty simple one. The respiratory system actually just has the lungs, the trachea, and the alveoli. And so that would look something like this. So here we have something over here. All right, so we have trachea. These are lungs, and inside the lungs are those tiny little bunches of grapes, which we also know as alveoli. The nervous system consists of the brain, the spinal cord, nerves, sensory organs. So every system has a unique set of organs. And here are much better pictures than I can scribble, which show you the digestive system and all the details of it, and the circulatory system and all the details, the nervous system and details, respiratory system and all kinds of details in there, and the excretory system. So these are all systems that are inside a mammal, and we're going to look at them step by step and one by one. But first, we need to find out, what are these organs and systems made of? Actually, it's pretty simple. There are only 4 main tissue types. So all those organs that look very complex and very different from each other are actually made out of just 4 different tissue types. So tissue types can either be epithelial, connective, muscular, or nervous. And these are all cells that are modified in one way or another. And we're going to look at those modifications. So epithelial tissue. First of all, we need to know that the tissue is going to reflect its function. And so the modifications of a cell are going to reflect that function. The primary function of an epithelial tissue is to protect the tissues that lie beneath it from radiation, from desiccation. Desiccation means drying out. Toxins, which are poisons. Invasion by pathogens, and any physical trauma. So protection is a primary function. So we can start thinking now, what would a cell have to do or look like to protect from all these different bad things? And another primary function of epithelial tissue is to regulate the exchange of chemicals between the underlying tissues. And this regulation is very selective. It's selective absorption, and there's transcellular transport. So it's going to have to regulate that. It's going to have to say how much can come in or go out. And epithelial tissue is also going to be required to secrete hormones, or secrete sweat, or mucus, or enzymes. So these are primary functions of epithelial tissues, and it also must, because it's the first barrier, it has to provide sensation. So you can see right away that there are a whole bunch of diversifications in this epithelial tissue. So there are three main types of epithelial cells. They can either look squamous, which is nice and squat and flat, a columnar, which means looking like a column, or cuboidal, which means they look like a cube. And epithelial cells are responsible for protection, again, and detection of sensation, secretion, selective absorption, transcellular transport. But the important thing is they actually don't contain blood vessels, which means instead of saying no blood vessels, we should just use the term avascular. So epithelial layers are avascular. So how are they supposed to live? Because they got to receive food and they have to get rid of waste. So nourishment is actually received by diffusion from the underlying connective tissue. The epithelial tissue, however, is innervated, which means it does have nerve cells, or nerve sensation is there. There's just no blood. And here are some pictures of simple cuboidal. So here the cells are about the same height and width. Simple squamous means they're wider than they are taller, so they're kind of flattened. And then simple columnar, they are taller rather than they're wider, so they're oriented this way. And then we can have stratified. Strata means layers. So the layers can be different shapes. So you can have a squamous epithelial layer like this, which could be just on top, but as you go deeper into the epithelial layers, you can come up with cuboidal down here, and it could actually be different. So there is epithelial tissue which varies in shape only because of the number of layers. So the simple epithelial cells, what are their functions? Squamous epithelial cells, well, they line areas of passive diffusion. So because they're flattened, you would find them in the walls of capillaries, or you would find them in the alveoli, or in the walls of the lungs. The cuboidal epithelium, then they're nice and cube-shaped. They usually have a secretory function, or an absorptive function, or an excretory function. They could be in the small collecting ducts of the kidneys, or the pancreas, or they could be in the salivary glands. So in the salivary glands, they would be actually doing secretory stuff. A columnar epithelium is very highly secretory, as in the wall of the stomach. So because they're very, very tall, they can actually have a lot of stuff in them. And or they can absorb a lot of stuff if they're inside the small intestine. And usually columnar epithelial cells extend out in microvilli, as we will see inside the stomach. So the stratified epithelial cells, what do they look like? So remember, stratified means layers or strata. So many layers of cells epithelial cells you can have a mixture. You can be all squamous, or cuboidal, or columnar, or a mix. And you need many layers of epithelium because this is used in areas of high stress and insult, like the skin. So, or any organ that gets distended or stretched, like the stomach. You put food in, it has to distend itself. So there's a pressure or stress associated with that cell, so it can't rupture. When the food goes away, then it has to squash back down. So these have to change, and so there's got to be a lot of layers, otherwise you will end up with a hole. So some cells will die, fall off, but there'll still be other layers behind it. You can also have pseudostratified epithelium, which is known as the respiratory epithelium, which lines the airways of your nose, your trachea, and bronchi. And notice it is actually just the one layer. But if you notice, they get different shapes. The nuclei move up and down, and they have these little extensions on the top, which look like hair, but they're actually finger-like villi. So this is where the epithelial tissue can be found in an organism, and these are all those types of epithelium that we just discussed. And as you can see, it depicts where is the cuboidal, the columnar, squamous, and so on in an animal. Next is the connective tissue. This, by its name, it connects. So it's just something that connects. These are cells that connect one type with another type of tissue. They're found in between other tissues everywhere in the body. Their function is to support or to connect or separate different types of tissues and organs in the body. Connective tissue also includes brown and white adipose tissue, which is brown and white fat. You may have heard of brown fat, but usually when you see fat, it's all white. Connective tissue, interestingly enough, is also blood. And I know blood is not like a tissue and it's a liquid, but it is connective tissue because it connects, right? It's a form of connection. Cartilage is connective tissue. Bone is connective tissue. And most immune system cells, they are like macrophages, mast cells, eosinophils. They're scattered inside the loose connective tissue, and they are kept there to start the immune response right away. What is the function of connective tissue? All connective tissue has three main components. So it can be either fibrous, it can be elastic or more collagenous, or it can be called ground substance, which means it's kind of amorphous and we can't really tell what it is, and or it could actually have the form of a cell, like a fibroblast or a macrophage or a leukocyte or an adipocyte, or it actually has a real defined shape, not like ground substance. Fibroblasts and fibers, like elastin, allow organs to resist stretching and to resist tearing, and they form loose, irregular connective tissue. So this is a good thing because you don't want your organs to, constantly be under repair because of something that happened that was small. Dense, regular connective tissue forms organized structures like tendons and ligaments. So these are very interesting ways that cells can actually help us. And here is a picture showing all those types of cells that we just talked about. But now we have a depiction. So here is fibrous connective tissue. Notice that this is, so we have, these are actually nuclei, and the rest of it is kind of wavy looking. This is collagen. Notice how it doesn't really have a defined structure. Some cells can be like this, some cells can be like this. So collagen is different. Bone is pretty well defined, and you still have nuclei and stuff like that. And then you have, of course, red blood cells inside the blood, fat droplets. So notice this is one cell, and it's got all these little droplets of fat inside. So this is an adipose tissue cell. The next type of tissue is muscular tissue. There are three types of muscular tissue: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. So skeletal muscles are those that are voluntary. So you actually can control them, or the organism can control them, whereas the smooth and the cardiac muscles are involuntary and the organism has no control over them. They are just automatic. Skeletal muscles are striated and are used for locomotion, and they usually make up about 40% of us. So these are all skeletal muscles, and you can see that they're striated, so they have striations, and these are the nuclei in between, and they're tubular cells, and there are many nuclei per cell. And this is an actual picture of muscle, not a cartoon version as I just drew over. So smooth muscles are found within the walls of digestive system, the respiratory system, the circulatory system, the excretory system, reproductive system, any system that we cannot control. And these muscle cells are actually very different. They're spindle-shaped. They only have one nucleus per cell, and you can see the cartoon picture on the left and an actual picture on the right, which shows you pictures of smooth muscle cells. The cardiac muscle is only found in the heart, and this is very different because it has intercalated calcium discs. So what you see, these intercalated discs are actually made out of calcium. They're interspersed between the cells, and they branch off each other. So the cells are branching off each other. You can see a nucleus here, and there's a nucleus here, then there's an intercalated disc here, and this muscle is self-contracting, and it is autonomically regulated. Why is that? We cannot control it because your heart has to beat about 100,000 times a day, which means about 35 million times a year, or about 2.5 billion times in your life, assuming you live about 70 or 80. So, and that comes from the simple calculation that your heart beats 72 times a minute. All right, so you cannot actually control this, and so this is why it is self-regulating. Here is a picture of where all these muscle tissues are, and these muscle cells in any organism. And then we come to the last part, which is nervous tissue. So nervous tissue is made up of neurons and neuroglia. Neurons are nerve cells, which very large cell bodies, and they have one axon or protrusion or a foot, and many smaller dendrites or hair-like protrusions around their sides. Neurons are very specialized cells because they take electrochemical signals and they transmit them down their axons to the next neuron by changing the voltage inside the cell. So isn't that clever? So here is the picture of a neuron, and here is the neuron cell body. That's the nucleus. Here is its foot or its axon, and these little guys are all extensions of the main cell, and they are used for communication with the adjoining neuron, so the neuron that is next door to it. So they talk to each other through these little extensions. A neuroglia looks similar to a neuron, except as you notice, it does not have a foot or one extra long axon. That is because their function is to support and to nourish the neuron itself, because the neuron is very important. The neuroglia, not so important. It's got a secondary role. It's supposed to just support the main guy, which is the neuron itself. Neurons can be sensory, which means they are afferent. Afferent. Notice the A. Afferent means they take the signal from the sense organ to the brain. Okay. Neurons can also be motor, and at that point they're called efferent because they take the signal from the brain to the muscle. So first you have to have a signal, and that is picked up by a sensory neuron, and the sensory neuron will take that signal, take it to the brain will understand it, and then it will activate a motor neuron and say move, or whatever the action is supposed to be. So these are the two main types of neurons. There are also interneurons, and they just connect neurons inside the brain. They're there because one neuron can only, sometimes it's not that long, sometimes it is. And if you have interneurons, they're just connecting neurons, just like if you had, let's say, extension cords. The function of the nervous tissue is information processing. And I actually have a YouTube video which I thought might be very nice for us to watch. So I hope that link was helpful. There are two types of global control systems. This is because when you have this many organs and tissues and systems, something has to control that. Otherwise, you'll have the right hand not knowing what the left hand is doing situation. Whereas, you have a heart, you have a stomach, you have a this and a that, and they all have to be regulated and controlled so that the organism doesn't experience any discomfort or any disadvantage, which will result in its exclusion from the gene pool, or getting eaten, that is. So there are control systems, and there are two types, and they are exerted on the systems and the organs, so all the parts work together synchronously and harmoniously. And those two control systems are called endocrine or nervous. So there are two systems. Both systems work by tiny changes. They regulate just a little bit. And the endocrine system uses hormones, and the nervous system uses signals. So we're going to look at what are the differences between these two. Endocrine hormones are very slow acting, but they're very long lasting, and they are broadcast throughout the body. They are not sent to one target, they're just sent throughout the body, but only the target organ will be affected and respond to it. The nervous impulses are very target specific. They're very transient, which means they're ephemeral, they last very little time, they're very fast. So you need two types of control systems because you need to respond to something both short-term and long-term that is going on in the environment. For instance, the short-term example would be if you touched something that was hot. You went to the oven and you accidentally touched it, and immediately your nervous impulse will make you move away from that so that you are saved. Then later you will start thinking about this and you'll say, well, I probably shouldn't be going back to that oven again, should I? And so you would learn that behavior and store it. Endocrine hormones, endocrine systems are slow acting. They take a really long time to start up, and then they actually last for a really, really long time. For instance, your growth hormone. You keep on growing, the hormone will keep on broadcasting and acting until you're about 25 or so, and then your bones don't get any longer. They are sealed off. So these are long-lasting, but they act very, very slowly. Endocrine systems affect gradual whole body changes, while nervous system results in rapid response to environmental changes. That's the difference. And here is a picture showing you how this happens. So on the left-hand side, you can see signaling by hormones. So there is an actual gland or a tissue that creates this hormone. which is sent through the blood, and the signal is traveling everywhere, but it is only captured by the target cells. As you can see, they are capturing the hormone right here, whereas these are not target cells, so they're not going to capture it. And then there will be a certain response to it. Signaling by neurons, well, you have a neuron, it's going to sense something. It will send that message really quickly down its foot to the next neuron, and it will pass it on until it finally gets to the brain. And it will actually result in a response which is very fast. So you will have that. There are two different types, and they're for different reasons, but both have a united function, which is a preservation of the organism. There are other feedback control systems, and that is the study of cybernetics. So cybernetics is an interdisciplinary study of the structure of regulatory systems. I know it sounds like a really big word and a very scary looking topic, but it just means that one action in a system causes some change in the environment, and that in turn will cause a system to adapt to new conditions. And so the entire system will change its behavior and move from that point to another. And that's a very general definition, but let's be more specific. So there is let's say there's a normal range for some variable, some internal, let's say temperature. So your normal range is 98.4 to 98.6. Okay? Well, all of a sudden you have a stimulus, and there is a change in the internal variable. So I don't know, you could be sitting near a really hot place. All right, and so that's a stimulus. Your body temperature, body is heating up. This is not good. So the sensor is going to send a message to the control center, which is your brain, and say, we don't want to be here because we're getting toasted. So there will be a response, and you'll move away, and then the normal range will be regained again, which is awfully nice. So a feedback loop is nothing but a description of exactly what we just looked at. In a system where a transformation occurs, there are inputs and outputs. So inputs are the result of the environment's influence on the system, and the outputs are the influence of the system on the environment. And input and output are separated by some duration of time, as in before and after, or past and present. And yes, I know, I see this very funny picture on the side of a baby's clothing. You put something in and you get something out. It's exactly like that. So how do loops work? How do feedback loops work? In every feedback loop, information about the result of a change or transformation is sent back to the input of the system as input data. And if the new data facilitate and accelerate the transformation in the same direction as the preceding results, it's called a positive feedback loop, and its effects are cumulative. If the new data produce a result in the opposite direction to the previous results, it's called a negative feedback loop, and the effects stabilize the system. So in the first case, which is positive feedback loops, there is exponential growth or exponential decline. In the second case, there is maintenance of equilibrium. So most of our feedback loops are indeed negative because we want to keep everything stable. But at certain times, we do need positive feedback loops. So positive feedback loops actually lead to divergent behavior. There's indefinite expansion, or explosion, or running to infinity, or total blocking of activities, which means like running to zero. Each plus will involve another plus, and it results in a snowball effect, like as in a chain reaction, or population explosion, or industrial expansion, or capital invested at compound interest, or inflation, or growth of cancer cells, or blood clotting, the atmosphere of Venus. These are all positive feedback loops. And this is pictures of all of that that we just looked at. One plus leads to another and another and another and another, and it becomes like a snowball. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and you end up with you move very, very far from where you started out from. Positive feedback loops, if they're left to themselves, can only lead to the destruction of the system through explosion or through blocking of all of its functions. This wild behavior of positive loops is controlled by negative loops to maintain the system. So cancer cells are cells that forget that they're not supposed to divide anymore. So they keep on dividing, and they're not supposed to do that. And that is a positive feedback loop. So it divides, and then it divides some more, and divides some more, and divides some more. But we don't, that is an aberrant behavior. Normally, when a cell divides, it doesn't go into that loop. It stays stable for a very long time, and only when it's time for it to get replaced does another cell appear. So cancer cells are just cells that forgot they're not supposed to divide anymore. Negative feedback loops actually lead to adaptive or goal-seeking behavior. They sustain the same level, or the temperature, or the concentration, or the speed, or the direction. So in a negative feedback loop, every variation toward a plus triggers a correction towards the minus. Okay, so if there's a variation, it's going to try and pull it back to a set point. There is tight control. The system will oscillate around an ideal equilibrium that it never, ever really actually attains. An example. So there are many examples. A thermostat or a water tank equipped by a float are simple examples of regulation by a negative feedback loop. So if you look at your thermostat, which is on the left, when the temperature, you set the temperature, okay, in this particular case, you've set it to 20 degrees. Well, the thermostat has a sensor. It's going to sense temperature rising. It'll let it rise for maybe 1 or 2 degrees, and then it will kick in and it will cool the place back to 20 degrees. Same thing if it is on heat and the temperature drops below 20 to maybe 18 or 16. Well, the thermostat will kick in, and the sensor will tell it to make more heat, and so bring it back to 20 degrees because the set point is 20. You set it there, and the negative feedback loop is going to constantly try and get to 20. There will be a little bit of variation, but not that much. In the example on the right, where there is a water tank, so that would be, for instance, in your bathroom. When the water level gets to a certain, why doesn't the tank overflow? When the water level gets to a certain place, it says, this is it. I don't need to get more water, and it stops filling the tank. If you have too many minuses, that also can happen. If you have a negative feedback loop that goes awry, you have a minus, which leads to another minus, which leads to another minus. Things are not going to move. They're just going to come to a standstill. So examples, not biological, but other examples of negative feedback loops gone awry are bankruptcy or economic depression. Here is an example that's actually biologic. So maybe it's time for exams, and maybe you have to study a lot. And so when you study a lot, you're probably not going to sleep that much. And if you don't sleep that much, you actually get tired. So when you get tired, that will actually diminish your ability to cope with stressors in a healthy way. And that is going to then this inability is going to disrupt your sleep, and then your disrupted sleep will increase your fatigue, and you keep on running around in this negative feedback loop, and you have to break out of it. So ultimately what will happen is you will go to sleep, and you will then restore the balance again. Sleep timing depends on a balance between the need for sleep since the last adequate sleep episode and a circadian rhythm, so the circadian is day and night, that determine the ideal timing of a restorative sleep episode. There are other feedback loops. So, for instance, here is one, low blood temperature. And this is another negative feedback loop. So it's going to say, not enough heat in the temperature of the blood. Well, the message is going to go to the brain. The brain will kick into action and say, well, we must heat up the body temperature, and it will tell the adrenal gland to produce this hormone, which will increase metabolism and make more heat, and it will send that feedback to the body. The hormone will be distributed, and the blood temperature will increase. Blood sugar levels, that's another thing that we regulate very, very tightly. All animals regulate their blood glucose. Mammals regulate their blood glucose with insulin and glucagon. These are two hormones. Insulin is secreted by the pancreas, and it transports glucose to the body cells and stores some it stores some in the liver and lowers blood glucose. So this word should actually not be there, so that we'll just cross it out. Glucagon is also secreted by the pancreas, interestingly enough, but it is the opposite of insulin. It helps the body utilize stored glycogen and convert it into glucose. So glucagon will increase the sugar in the blood, where insulin decreases the sugar in the blood. And they act in concert with them, each other, and it's a tug of war, who does more at what time. So body temperature is controlled. There are two ways of thermoregulation. You can either set your body temperature a certain degree. If you're a homeotherm, you're going to do that. Or you're going to allow, up to a limit, the environmental temperature to regulate your activities if you're a poikilotherm. That means cold-blooded. So let's see. Something that's cold-blooded can also be called a poikilotherm, a temperature conformer, or an ectotherm. Something that's warm-blooded, like us, you can be called an endotherm, a homeotherm, a temperature regulator. These are all synonyms, and I just want you to know not to be thrown off by these different words, because they all mean the same. And here are examples of endotherms and ectotherms. So an otter is a homeotherm or an endotherm. He regulates his body temperature. He wants it to be 98.4, whereas fish actually don't do that. They let the environment regulate their body temperature up to a limit. Yeah, I mean, if it's going to get to be freezing, then the fish is going to die. It's not going to let it do that. But other than that, it's just going to slow down if it gets really, really cold. And it won't be so active. But the difference is, and here is a graph to show you that. So you have a body temperature on the y-axis and environmental temperature on the x-axis. And so as you see, the x-axis temperature increases from 10 to 20, 30, 40 degrees centigrade. Well, what happens to the body temperature of the otter? Nothing. It just stays flat. It's simple. It regulates its body temperature, and it doesn't change its temperature with its environment, which is the river. However, a fish also living in the same environment, its temperature actually will change. So as the river gets warmer, and the fish is going to get warmer too. And this is the difference between a poikilotherm like fish and a homeotherm like the otter. Endotherms or homeotherms can increase your heat production by 5 to 10 times. And how do they do that? They can raise the body temperature by shivering. That's the very first response. They can use up brown fat, which is deep down, or they can make mitochondria produce more heat than ATP. So they can switch. Instead of producing more energy, why don't you just not do that and produce more heat? There are also cyclic variations like circadian rhythms or circannual rhythms, and they contribute to the control of heat loss. So you don't want to lose a lot of heat in the winter, but you do want to lose a lot in the summer. So that's a circannual rhythm. Circadian rhythm would be you want to lose a lot of heat during the day, but not so much during the night when you're not actually doing anything. So that's a cyclic variation. Hibernation is different. That has a dramatic drop of the basal metabolic rate, and it's different from torpor. And let's just take a look at that. This comes into energy budgets of animals. Hibernation, basal metabolic rate, torpor, circadian rhythms. These are terms I just talked about, but we didn't actually go into them. But they're all involved in the energy budget of an animal. Every animal has a budget of energy. The study of energy budgets is actually called bioenergetics. And let's look at these one by one. So here is a circadian rhythm. So what happens? Here is morning, evening, and night. And so we have, let's look at the very top. And in the top, you can see it's midnight. Okay, let's start here. And the animal is actually sleeping. So the heart rate is low. The body temperature is low. And as the sleep ends at 6 a.m. when the animal wakes up, there's an increase in body temperature, body pressure, and actually in the highest rate of cardiac arrest. And then you go through the day, and your fastest reaction time is actually sometime in the afternoon, like 3 o'clock, believe it or not. And then around 6 p.m., the animal starts to wind down, but your greatest muscle strength occurs in the evening. Isn't that interesting? And then the animal has to shut down all its systems to go to sleep, and you have the start of melatonin secretion, which helps you go to sleep and shut down your systems. Your metabolic rate is actually proportional to body mass, and there is a formula. Metabolic rate is equal to mass. Whoops. So this is metabolic rate, and this is mass. So that's your body mass. And it isn't equal to it, but it is equal to the 3/4 power to mass. That means that energy expenditure is inversely proportional to body size. That means as size decreases, you're going to spend a lot more energy trying to maintain yourself. So smaller animals have very high metabolic rates per gram than larger animals. And generally speaking, endotherms or homeotherms have higher metabolic rates than ectotherms. And that is obvious because they're spending an awful lot of energy trying to keep their body temperature constant. What does mass raised to 3/4 mean? So I graphed it for you to have you look at it. Now here, if you had a one-to-one relationship, like metabolic rate is equal to mass, then that would actually be this line. So as your mass increased, your metabolic rate is going to increase. Got it? However, in animals, that is not quite true. What we have is this red line, and that is 3/4. Okay, so this is a sublinear plot, so it's not quite the same as 1:1. So the higher metabolic rate of smaller animals leads to many consequences: higher breathing rate, higher heart rate, and therefore generally a relatively greater blood volume as compared to a bigger animal. So when we talk about metabolic rates, there's several ways to look at it. There's a basal metabolic rate, and that is the BMR that your doctor will tell you. It's the minimum rate for homeotherms when an animal is not losing or gaining heat or is stressed. So that's your basal rate, the base. For human males, it's about 1,600 to 1,800 kilocalories per day. For females, it's about 1,300 to 1,500 kilocalories per day, which is about the same rate of use as a 75-watt light bulb. Not a lot, not a lot. So we don't actually spend an awful lot of energy, much more than a light bulb in one day. But when we look at basal metabolic rate for differing animals, something very interesting shows up. So this is actually a log-log plot. And how do you know that? Because you can see that the divisions are not equal. Yes? So we know this from previous work. And on the x-axis is put the body mass in kilograms. And on the y-axis, you have the basal metabolic rate. What you see is, if you look at the body mass and you calculate it with the basal metabolic rate, the harvest mouse has the smallest body mass, yeah, as compared to an elephant. Yes? And what you see is the basal metabolic rate obviously is increasing with the body mass like this. So harvest mass is small, elephant is big, everybody else is in between, and you see a nice relationship between that. But if you actually did a plot like this, where only the x-axis is log and the y-axis is not, what do you see? So body mass of a shrew is pretty small. Elephant's body mass is pretty big. But the basal metabolic rate of a shrew is an awful lot much more. And this is hours per kilogram than an elephant. And let's go back to, I don't know that I can go back. No, I don't think I can, but you certainly can pause this video and go back to the previous slide and look at the units of here and see how that is different. So it shows you that the smaller the animal, there's going to be a limit. You can't get very much smaller and still be able to maintain your body rates. And you can't get very much bigger than an elephant and still be able, I mean, look at him, and the poor guy is all the way down to the y-axis. So you can't actually get bigger or smaller. Those are kind of big limits on imposed by the basal metabolic rate. And here is another picture that shows you that, but actually pictorially. So what you have is metabolism, which is, you know, building up and breaking down. Anabolism is building up, catabolism is breaking down. And then you have the resting or the basal metabolic rate. So that would be the metabolic rate over here on the y-axis. And it's in energy per unit mass per hour. Okay. And so what you see is that the size and the metabolic rate is actually inversely proportional. Isn't that interesting? So the smallest size has the highest metabolic rate, and the biggest size has the lowest metabolic rate. And the smallest size is, you know, a few grams, whereas an elephant is 4,000 grams or above. You can also compare the basal metabolic rate with between thermal regulators and conformers. So somebody who is a regulator and somebody who isn't, like a cold-blooded snake and a warm-blooded mouse. So if we compare them, what do we see? Let's just look at the, start on the right-hand side and look at our snake. So he's cold-blooded. All right. We're going to look at the pie chart over here, which tells you exactly how much is he spending on what. All his energy budget. This is his energy budget. So if we look at the blue part, that is his basal rate. So that's how much he has to spend just to stay alive and do nothing. And then if you look at the yellow part, that is his activity. So that is, you know, he crawls around, so he spends some energy on that. He spends some energy on growth, and he spends a little bit of energy on reproduction. All right? Okay, moving on to the deer mouse. His energy budget, well, his basal metabolic rate is kind of certainly not as big as the endotherm. And what you see is that he is spending some energy on activities, but still not that much. But the bulk of his energy is spent on regulating his temperature, which is exactly the same as this part. Do you see it? The pie chart is just the same amount. So the bulk of the energy in an ectotherm is spent on BMR, whereas in an endotherm, it's spent on thermoregulation, which is kind of the reverse. So you can see that a snake is only going to spend about 8,000 kilocalories per year, whereas this deer mouse who hibernates is only going to spend 4,000 kilocalories per year. But notice how small the mouse is as compared to the snake. Then, if you're going to compare apples to apples, we can have actually a penguin, which is the same size as a snake, all right? Because it's 4 kilograms, and this is 4 kilograms too. Well, right away you can see that if you compare apples to apples, the penguin is spending 340,000 kilocalories per year, whereas the python is only spending 8,000. And why is that? Well, again, the basal metabolic rate, the penguin spends a bunch of energy on that, but most of its energy is spent on activities. And so he runs around, tries to go look for food, so therefore he doesn't spend very much at all on reproduction, because there's only so much energy to go around. And he spends some on thermoregulation, but not as much as if you compare these two guys together. See, his size is much bigger. This guy has a much smaller size, and so therefore there is the illustration of, you know, if you're too big, that's fine, but if you're too small, not so fine, because you're going to have to spend an awful lot of energy just trying to maintain yourself. So the average daily rate of energy consumption is about 2 to 4 times your basal metabolic rate. Okay, so that's why we can say, you know, it's about a 70-watt light bulb that we do. But unfortunately, since we don't exercise, or we're very sedentary now, our lifestyle is pretty sedentary, so now our rate of energy consumption is about 1.5 basal metabolic rate. So we really don't need that much energy. So if we do eat like our forefathers who scurried around hunting and gathering all day long, yes, we should be spending 2 to 4 times our basal metabolic rate. But we don't do that. And so if we're still eating the same amount, then obviously we're going to not be using all that energy, and we'll just be storing it. So trade-offs will shape the evolution of body plans. As size decreases, each gram of tissue increases in energy cost. All right. As size increases, although the energy costs per gram per tissue decrease, there's more tissue that is required for support and locomotion. So that is why body plans have limits. Torpor is something that we looked at for a minute, and we didn't actually talk about it. What is torpor, and how is it different from hibernation? So torpor, in torpor, the basal metabolic rate drops down dramatically. It's really an umbrella term. It describes all types of body temperature and metabolism reducing functions, but it's usually something short term. So that's reduced temperature, okay, but it's maybe every day and only a few hours at a time. For instance, hummingbirds are very, very small, and they spend an awful lot of energy maintaining their body temperature. So therefore, during the middle of the day, they just can't keep up with it. And you'll see them inverting themselves under a leaf and just going into torpor for a few hours, just so they can catch up. Torpor is different from sleep. Sleep is something completely different. It is characterized by changes in the brain activity. So some aspects of sleep are similar to hibernation, like reducing the heart rate and breathing rate and lower body temperature, but they're very, very slight. And the difference is the animal is easily awakened, whereas not so much in torpor. And sleep is dependent on circadian rhythms and on diurnal clocks. So torpor is a well-controlled thermoregulatory process, and it's not the result of switching off thermoregulation. It's just a short-term reduction of body temperature resulting in sluggishness, and it's a strategy to reduce energy costs because they're so high. Large mammals can actually not have to do torpor because they can walk, they can migrate to warmer areas, or they can grow a long, dense winter coat. But these options are not open to smaller ones, so they can't do that, and so therefore they go into torpor. Small mammals will face other disadvantages too. They have a larger surface area to volume ratio, and so they lose heat more quickly. Just like newborn babies, they have a larger surface area to volume ratio, and they lose heat very quickly too, so they have to be swaddled all the time. And small mammals have very short and thin fur. Usually they're not really thick furred. So they already need a high metabolic rate to maintain their body temperature. They can't increase this even no matter how much they eat, and when food is scarce, they can't do it at all. So the solution is to let the body temperature fall as a strategy to reduce energetic costs. So hummingbirds, as I said, have an incredibly high metabolic rate. Their heart rate is more than 1,200 beats per minute. Okay, so we beat at 72 beats per minute. Their energy consumption is so great that they have to use daily torpor to conserve energy. Hummingbird torpor is actually pretty much more profound than other birds. Hibernation is a long-term torpor, and the energy savings is pretty significant. It can be up to 20 times. Small animals tend to be more likely to hibernate because they can't migrate. Migration will require enormous amounts of energy relative to the body size, and larger animals are less apt to hibernate because if they go into hibernation, they're going to need a lot of energy to get back out of hibernation to warm it up. So it's usually mid-sized animals that hibernate. The brain waves of hibernating animals resemble their wakeful brain wave patterns, somewhat suppressed. In hibernation, the circadian clock is suspended. The body can cool down to below 0 degrees. And actually in hibernation, a really cool thing happens, that the urine is recycled. So the animal doesn't have to get up, go drink some water, go back to sleep. And it's mainly controlled by the endocrine system, where the hormones control every physiological aspect of hibernation. The body temperatures in hibernation drop a lot lower than in torpor. Metabolic rates fall to between 1 to 2% of the active animal. So, for instance, the heart rate of an active hedgehog or a chipmunk is 200 to 280 beats per minute, but only 5 beats per minute in hibernation. So that's a huge energy savings. And the breathing rate can actually drop from 50% all the way down to 100%, so the animal just won't breathe. Consciousness, therefore, is greatly diminished in hibernation, and waking the animal up would require so much energy. You can do it, but you would effectively kill it. So you should never wake up a hibernating animal. All right, so that is all I have for you for body forms, and I will see you next time when we talk about a different topic.